They have SBI Ripple Asia and Ripple Labs, the 9% I talked about, and they 100% own the bridge to the XDC network. Today I'm going to be talking about the R3 Corda to XDC connection, how R3 Corda is structured, basically its own private blockchain with the banks, how Impel built the bridge to the XDC network. SBI basically acquired the entire bridge of May 2024, and then the XRP and XDC connection through the holding company SBI. Stay tuned. So R3 Corda, real quick, is a company that most people are focused on in the XRP community, but they were founded in 2014, and there's a lot of banks that own them. Their whole goal right now is tokenizing basically real world assets and putting them on their private blockchain. And the word private is really important here. So the reason why R3 Corda is important is because there's a lot of banks who own R3 Corda, and it's not as fun as talking about XRP and XDC, but they're a big player and banks trust them a lot, personally, because they're owned by the banks. But there's about 200 plus financial institutions, and they're jointly owned. There isn't really one, majority shareholder. And I think that was by design. I know there was one bank that wanted to be a majority, and at least from the articles I was reading, they were having issues with that. But then they kind of moved off and did their own thing. I have another graphic talking about that. R3 Corda is designed as a personal private blockchain for the banks. And so they can deploy their real world assets such as real estate, oil, stocks, and they can maintain basically the data. They don't necessarily want everyone knowing what the holdings are. That's why they work with R3 Corda. So this article is talking about XDC and the R3, and it's not really a proof anymore. They're really using it, but this is back in 2023, and I think the company SBI bought them out. But yeah, XDC is a layer 1 hybrid, and that's important because we're going from an R3 private blockchain, and they use the bridge Impel to connect to the XDC network. And I think that's going to be important, especially as we move towards global trade. So as you know, Swift is, basically the current system, and Impel is basically the next gen alternative to Swift. And so it's just the integration layer from your personal blockchain to your public blockchain. And I know I don't want to keep getting too deep into the weeds, but this is really important because the capital is flowing from your private blockchain to the public blockchain, and we need the ability to track it. And as a reminder, what are we sending and what is the capital coming from? It's coming from these real world assets that are now living on the blockchain, but they're living on multiple different blockchains. But R3 Corda is a very big one because it's backed by the banks. And so US treasuries, government debt, corporate bonds, they're all living on the blockchain, and the bridge is just is pretty much the missing piece from the private blockchain to the public blockchain, and that's where the money is flowing, and that's the so-called rails of the system. Now here's where the fun lives. XRP and XDC are connected, and I've tried to really kind of explain this, but let me break this down. SBI owns the bridge now between R3 Corda and XDC. XDC was really the only public blockchain up until recently before they moved to Solana, taking the private blockchain and moving it to public. That was a big deal. But XDC is ISO compliant. XRP is also ISO compliant. And as you know, the ISO 20022 standard is really important right now. It's kind of the biggest deal, in my opinion, for these banks. So the person who built the bridge, he has about 24 years in the Swift system, at least as an advisor. He was then in the inception of the XDC network. And so he was funded by, I think, the SBI Holdings people. They're the only bridge right now to the XDC network, and it's completely owned by SBI. But this is where the XRP XDC connection comes in, because these banks own R3 Corda. They also, the holding company owns the bridge. XDC has the know your customers to know which bank has the relay nodes, the verifiers. So SBI Holdings, their majority shareholder is this group, which is part of the BIS system, if I remember. But let me go into the financials of SBI. They have about 9% in Ripple, at least for the Ripple Labs in Japan. And they also have XRP. So their real focus is more on the global infrastructure for the trade deficit. And I have another graphic that I built talking about the trade deficit, but there was just too much information to go over in this video. They're also part of R3 Corda. They have SBI Ripple Asia and Ripple Labs, the 9% I talked about, and they 100% own the bridge to the XDC network. So I wanted to show you the connection. So when folks talk about how XDC is not related to XRP, you need the infrastructure layer for the real world assets, but you also need XRP for, I believe, more as a store of value. So a little graphic of how the bridge works. You have their real world assets on Corda. The bridge gets activated. We're all sending through the ISO compliance, basically the messaging, and it's a hybrid approach. XDC settles it. And as you know, to use XDC, you need the gas, which is the native token. I have another graphic that talks about R3 Corda and some of the investment strategies of these banks. But really what I'm seeing is more of a shotgun approach. These banks are going, hey, we're going to own everything. But really what I'm focused on is the ISO compliance, because the banks have to adopt, they had to adopt that recently. And that's kind of where I'm looking at it from my perspective. Hey, I have all these blockchains. There's almost so much out here, but my focus right now is who is fixing the problem of the global trade deficit, and XRP, XDC, XLM, and HBAR. In my opinion, they're developing the network the best, and they also have the compliance of the ISO standard.